Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a pair of heels that were never built for comfort, and a job that was never quite what the brochures promised. We're spending tonight with the American stewardess of the 1950s, a woman sold to the public as pure elegance, floating effortlessly through the clouds. What we're actually going to find, underneath the lipstick and the pillbox hat, is one of the most physically brutal, tightly controlled jobs a young woman could hold in mid-century America. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your body go heavy. If this is your first time here, a quiet thank you for finding us, and if you've been here before, you already know what to do. Dim the lights, let something hum softly in the background, and let's drift into 1954 together. Before we go anywhere, sit with these questions for a moment. Could you smile for 14 hours straight while a girdle slowly rearranged your internal organs? Could you pass a job interview that measured your teeth, your ankles, your marital status, and the exact number on a bathroom scale? Could you carve a roast beef dinner in the middle of a thunderstorm at 4,000 feet without landing it in someone's lap? And could you accept calmly that the moment you turned 32, you'd officially become too old to serve coffee? If any of that sounds absurd, good. It was. Welcome to a single day in the life of a 1950s stewardess. Chapter 1. The interview that wasn't really about flying. Long before you ever set foot on an aircraft, you have to survive the hearing process, and calling it a job interview is generous. It functions more like a pageant with a clipboard. The airlines want you young, somewhere between 20 and 26. They want you unmarried. They want you within a narrow band of height and an even narrower band of weight. Straight teeth, clear skin, no visible blemishes. And critically, no eyeglasses, because apparently perfect vision is a job requirement more essential than the ability to read a safety manual. Prior aviation experience is optional. Looking flawless under scrutiny is not. You arrive dressed in your finest and sit before a panel that studies you the way a buyer studies livestock at auction. Your height gets checked against a wall chart, too short, and you can't reach the overhead compartments, too tall, and you ruin the tidy visual line of the uniform. There is exactly one acceptable range, and you either land inside it or you don't. They examine your hands, because those hands will be visible to every passenger pouring coffee. They examine your posture. They ask, delicately or not so delicately, whether you're engaged, whether you're seeing anyone, whether marriage is somewhere on your horizon, and the only acceptable answer to all of it is a firm no. You are, in effect, applying for a job whose hidden clause is a promise to remain single indefinitely. Then comes the vision test, and here the logic collapses entirely. A woman capable of guiding 80 frightened strangers through a smoke-filled cabin evacuation can be turned away because she needs glasses to read a restaurant menu. It doesn't matter that her composure could hold together an entire flight in a crisis. What matters is the photograph, the poster, the fantasy, and glasses don't fit the fantasy. If you clear the physical gauntlet, there's still the personality assessment. Are you warm without being forward, graceful under stress, able to project calm delight for hours without visible fatigue? The airlines are, without saying so, hearing extraordinary women and marketing them as merely decorative ones. Thousands apply. A small fraction are chosen. Making it through isn't luck, it's surviving a selection process engineered to reject almost everyone who tries. Congratulations. You've been measured, weighed, and interrogated, and you still walked out with the job. Now they're going to send you somewhere to be reshaped entirely. Chapter 2, Stewardess School. There's no chemistry class here, no textbooks on aerodynamics. Stewardess training in the 1950s is part military drill, part finishing school, and the emphasis leans hard toward the finishing school half. You'll spend your days learning how to walk without wobbling, how to sit without slouching, how to reapply lipstick in a moving vehicle without smearing it across your cheek, and somewhere in between all of that, how to handle an actual emergency. Posture becomes an obsession. Instructors drill you until standing up straight stops being a conscious effort and simply becomes how your spine sits by default. You practice entering a cabin the correct way, pivoting gracefully in a narrow aisle, moving as if gravity applies to you a little less than it applies to everyone else. Grooming classes sound harmless and are anything but. You're taught the exact hairstyle expected of you, the exact shade of lipstick permitted, the precise polished colors that pass inspection, and you're expected to replicate this look flawlessly every single day for the rest of your career. You practice applying your face while a chair shakes beneath you, because you'll need that exact skill on every real flight to come. Then there's service training. Hour after hour of carrying trays down a mock aisle, memorizing who ordered what, pouring hot coffee without spilling a drop while an instructor deliberately jostles the room. You rehearse the coffee pot the way a soldier rehearses assembling a rifle, because in a very real sense, it will become both your tool and your burden. And you learn to smile, not casually, professionally, structurally, as an athletic discipline. Spill a drink on someone, smile. Passenger is rude, smile. Plane drops suddenly through an air pocket, smile, because 100 nervous strangers are reading your face to decide whether they should panic. Your composure functions as their emotional seatbelt. Yes, there's real safety training buried in the schedule: evacuations, first aid, what to do when an engine fails. But it competes for hours with lessons in small talk and table setting, and you learn quickly which subject the company actually prioritizes, no matter what the manual claims. By the time you graduate, you've been rebuilt from the ground up, poised, polished, unshakable. You walked in an applicant and you walk out something closer to a finely tuned instrument. And your first real test as that instrument has nothing to do with the sky. It has to do with a scale. Chapter 3: The Scale. Your weight is not a private matter anymore. It belongs to the company now, tracked against a rigid chart tied to your height, checked at intervals by a supervisor holding a clipboard and an unimpressed expression. Gain a few pounds past the line, and you can be grounded, warned, or ordered to lose it before you're allowed back on a flight. There is an actual printed chart pairing height to a maximum permitted weight. And heaven help you if the number drifts upward. You're managed the way cargo is managed, weighed and measured as if you might unbalance the aircraft. A few pounds over and the comments start quietly, then escalate. Enough weight gain, and you can be pulled from the schedule entirely until you bring the number back down. The cruelty is in the mismatch. This is a job of constant physical labor, hauling heavy trays, bending, lifting, walking miles of narrow aisle every shift. Your body burns fuel like a furnace, and yet the company wants you slender regardless of what the actual work demands. Your body needs calories to survive the shift. The chart wants you delicate. You are the battlefield where those two facts collide. You could be flawless at the job itself, calm during turbulence, quick in a crisis, beloved by every passenger you serve, and still lose your position because a needle tipped 3 pounds past a number someone printed on a form. Competence weighs nothing on that particular scale, so you learn to dread it the way you dread a hard landing, and you eat accordingly, quietly, and you keep smiling, because complaining was never part of the image. Chapter 4: The Girdle. Underneath that crisp uniform sits a piece of engineering nobody asked you to wear voluntarily: the girdle. It isn't optional. It's expected, and sometimes checked, because God forbid a working woman's silhouette show a single natural curve. You spend 14 hours compressed like a parcel, bending and lifting and hauling down a narrow aisle while your ribs quietly file a formal complaint. It is not a gentle garment. It's firm, unyielding, engineered to smooth you into the tidy shape the company prefers, and once it's on, there's no relief until the shift ends. No quiet moment in the galley to loosen it. You're cinched in for the duration, and on these slow propeller flights, the duration can stretch for the better part of a day. Now add the labor on top of that constriction. Every task reaching low seats, hoisting heavy trays, twisting through the aisle fights directly against a garment designed for standing still, not for the athletic reality of feeding 100 passengers at altitude. Your body wants to move. The girdle wants you motionless and sculpted. Hours of that compression in a warm cabin doing physical labor leaves you feeling faintly strangled the entire shift, and still, your face has to stay serene. There are inspections, too. Supervisors can verify bluntly that the required undergarment is properly in place before clearing you to work, treating a grown professional the way a schoolteacher treats a uniform violation. It reveals something true about the whole arrangement. Your body is not entirely your own while you're on the clock. It has been weighed, measured, cinched, and displayed, all in service of a silhouette dreamed up for a recruitment poster. Chapter 5. The Uniform in the Face. The outfit itself is genuinely beautiful: tailored jacket, pressed skirt, white gloves, a small hat pinned at a precise angle, and always heels. And every piece comes with a rule, and every rule comes with someone waiting to enforce it. The jacket stays buttoned no matter how warm the cabin gets, because a stewardess in rolled-up sleeves ruins the illusion. You sweat quietly and keep smiling, because visible discomfort breaks the unwritten code. The white gloves are meant to stay spotless through a full shift of pouring coffee and serving gravy, a standard that seems built to be nearly impossible, and you guard them like they're precious. The hat is pinned to survive turbulence and hustle alike, adjusted and readjusted throughout the day, because a crooked hat is exactly the sort of thing a supervisor notices. And the heels never come off, not even when your arches are screaming by hour 6. You're performing a full day of manual labor on the balls of your feet, in shoes built purely for appearance. Before you're ever cleared to face a passenger, there's a face inspection too. Hair can't touch the collar. Makeup must be present but understated, never bold enough to raise an eyebrow, never absent enough to look unfinished. Nail polish must be an approved shade. You rebuild this entire look from scratch every single morning, often in an unfamiliar hotel bathroom, because there's no rolling out of bed and simply reporting to work. If any piece is off, a supervisor's eye catches it, and you're sent to fix it. A fully grown professional dispatched to correct her lipstick like a teenager caught breaking a dress code. Chapter 6. A wedding ring is a resignation letter. Here's a rule that lands like a slap by modern standards. Get married and you are typically let go. That's the entire policy. A wedding band functions in practice as your own resignation notice. So women hide engagements. They delay weddings. They flinch every time a supervisor's eyes drift toward their left hand. The reasoning, if you can call it that, is about image. The stewardess is marketed as the ideal single woman, available, charming, unattached, forever part of the fantasy. A married woman in the company's eyes belongs somewhere else now, to a household, not to the aisle. So the choice is blunt. You may work the skis or you may build a marriage, but not both. This traps women in an impossible position, choosing between a career they fought hard to earn and the ordinary human wish to build a life with someone. Engagements happen in secret. Rings get worn on chains under blouses, or left at home entirely. Somewhere behind that professional smile, a woman might be planning an entire future she can't speak of out loud, because good news in this job comes with the power to end everything. Consider the asymmetry. A man in nearly any other career could marry freely and keep working without a second thought, his wedding a cause for celebration rather than dismissal. But a skilled, capable stewardess is told that falling in love disqualifies her, as though the company hired her youth and her singleness rather than her actual ability, and marriage simply returns those things to someone else. So women live carefully divided lives, guarding relationships like classified information, timing their choices around a company policy that treats love itself as a liability. Chapter 7. The Clock You Can't Outrun. Say you dodge the marriage trap entirely. You stay single, careful, disciplined. Don't relax yet, because there's a second deadline coming for you, and this one can't be outsmarted by hiding a ring on a chain. It's your age, and it arrives on schedule no matter what you do. Many airlines quietly ease stewardesses out once they hit their early 30s, as if a woman's body simply stops functioning properly the moment she crosses 32. You could be the best in the building, steady under pressure, adored by regular passengers, sharper at the job than anyone half your age. None of that matters. The birthday arrives and so does the notice. The underlying message is not subtle. The company was never really buying your skill because skill only grows with time. It was buying your youth, and youth has an expiration date the company finds inconvenient. So an age ceiling hangs over the entire profession, and everyone hears the ticking, even while smiling through it. Think about how backward this is compared to almost any other line of work. In most professions, experience is treated as an asset. The longer you do something, the more valuable you become. A veteran stewardess should, by that logic, be the most prized person in the cabin. She reads a nervous passenger's face before he even says a word. She calms a difficult drinker without incident. She knows exactly how to keep a rattled cabin steady through turbulence. And that's precisely the moment the company decides her calendar has run out. It's the equivalent of firing your most capable employee for the singular offense of getting good at the job. There's a quiet dread threaded through the whole career because of it, a constant awareness that you're racing something you cannot beat. You watch older colleagues get eased toward the door, and you understand you're looking directly at your own near future. It's difficult to feel secure in a role that treats your continued existence as an inconvenience. 32 isn't old by any reasonable measure. A woman at that age is often at her sharpest, most composed, most confident. But the fantasy has no room for her, so she's replaced by someone younger who will eventually be replaced in turn. It's a conveyor belt built entirely on youth, and everyone riding it knows exactly where the belt ends. So you smile through the ticking, because complaining about your own impending expiration date is, naturally, not part of the image either. You enjoy the bright, brief stretch you're given and try not to dwell too hard on its edges. Chapter 8. Morning in a city you don't recognize. Now let's actually walk through a working day, and it starts with a jarring ring in a room that isn't yours. A hotel telephone jolts you awake, a cheerful stranger's voice announcing your wake-up call, and there is no snooze button anywhere in this arrangement. You blink at an unfamiliar ceiling for a few seconds, piecing together which city you landed in last night, because they've all started blending into the same beige wallpaper and the same heavy curtains. There's no gentle drifting into consciousness here. A voice from the front desk states the hour, and the hour is final, because a crew that misses report time is a flight that doesn't leave on schedule. So you rise the instant you're summoned, regardless of how little sleep the last flight left you, regardless of how early this one starts. Then begins the full daily reconstruction, the styled hair, the tasteful makeup, the pressed uniform, the pinned hat, the polished nails, all assembled from nothing, in a rush, in a bathroom that belongs to a hotel chain rather than to you. You build this entire fantasy fresh every single morning because you never sleep in your own bed, and you never wake up already prepared. Your feet, meanwhile, are lodging their own complaints before you've even taken 10 steps. They haven't forgotten yesterday's 14 hours in those heels, the endless aisle, the standing, the lifting. Rest was supposed to repair them. Rest was too short, and the damage runs deep. There's a genuine loneliness folded into this too. You wake in an empty room in a city where you know absolutely no one, and your job today is to walk out and smile warmly at 100 strangers. The glamorous image the public holds, a jet-setting woman waking up in some exotic locale, looks considerably different from where you're standing. A tired woman doing her hair by an unfamiliar mirror, bracing herself for the day with nobody there to witness the effort it takes. Chapter 9. The Briefing. Before the passengers, before the coffee cart, before any of the day's performance begins, there's the briefing. You gather with the rest of the crew to go over the route, the weather forecast, the number of passengers aboard, and any special circumstances, which usually translates to someone important or someone difficult, sitting in one of those seats. You confirm the meal plan, review the emergency equipment, and settle who's responsible for what. This is the moment the job shows its serious face, the one that never makes it onto a recruitment poster. Here, briefly, you're not an ornament, you're a working member of a crew with real responsibilities. A stewardess who tunes out during this meeting is a stewardess caught flat-footed the moment something goes wrong later in the flight, so you listen closely. The weather comes up first, and it's the part that makes everyone brace slightly. These aircraft are slow, and they fly low enough to feel every mood the sky is in, rather than gliding calmly above it. A forecast calling for rough air is really a forecast for a long, difficult day of serving hot meals on an unstable floor. Knowing it's coming doesn't stop it, but at least you won't be blindsided. Then the passenger list and its special cases. Perhaps someone notable is flying today and needs extra attention. Perhaps someone has a reputation for being difficult, someone who treats the crew as personal staff. Perhaps a passenger requires particular care for health reasons. You file all of it away, because knowing in advance beats discovering it mid-flight. You also walk through meal service logistics. Who plates what, in what order, so the whole choreography runs smoothly once you're airborne. And crucially, you review the safety equipment and emergency procedures, the genuinely life-or-death portion of the job hiding quietly beneath all the charm. This is the reminder that behind the hat and the coffee pot, you've actually been trained for real trouble. There's something steadying about this brief huddle of professionals sorting out a plan together. A few minutes where you're not performing for anyone, just doing your job among people doing theirs. Then the cabin doors open, and the performance resumes. Chapter 10, Meeting the Machine. Time to meet your workplace for the day, and it is loud, enormous, and entirely unapologetic about both. This is the era before jets, so you'll spend today inside a long metal tube powered by propeller engines that roar like an argument that never quite ends. These planes fly lower and slower than what's coming in future decades, which means longer flights and a much more intimate relationship with every patch of rough weather along the way. You'll come to know turbulence the way a sailor knows the sea, which, on this particular route, is currently in a mood. Step aboard and the first thing you notice is the sound, or rather, the promise that the sound is about to arrive and never leave. Once those engines fire, a droning thunder settles over the whole cabin, something you feel in your chest as much as hear in your ears. You raise your voice to be heard over it all day, and by the time you finally land, silence feels almost foreign. Then there's the pace, nothing like the swift crossings future travelers will take for granted. These aircraft cruise low and slow, so a trip a modern jet would finish in a couple of hours stretches on for the better part of a day. More time in the air means more time on your feet, more time serving, more time soothing, more time smiling. The distance hasn't changed. The clock has. And flying low means flying through the weather instead of above it. A future jet will climb high over most of the sky's tantrums and cruise along in calm air. Your aircraft does no such thing. It plows directly through the clouds and the currents, feeling every gust and pressure shift along the way. You learn which bumps are harmless and which ones send the coffee flying. Nobody teaches you this distinction in a classroom. The sky teaches you, one lurch at a time. Chapter 11, The Safety Demonstration. Now you stand at the front of the cabin and perform, because part of this job really is theater. You demonstrate the seatbelt, point toward the exits, and describe calmly, warmly, exactly what to do if the flight goes seriously wrong, all while smiling as though you're describing a picnic menu. Half the cabin watches politely. The other half is already lighting cigarettes, entirely uninterested. You continue anyway, because the one time it matters, it will matter enormously. You hold up the buckle and demonstrate it as though grown adults have never encountered a seatbelt before. You gesture toward the exits with a practiced sweep of the hand. You explain, in a pleasant and measured tone, precisely what to do in the event of real trouble. And you do all of this smiling, because a nervous cabin is a difficult cabin, and nobody boarding needs a grim delivery of everything that could theoretically go wrong. Here's the part that stays with you underneath the theater. You know exactly where every exit is because you learned it for real in training, as a matter of genuine survival. Those exits you're gesturing toward so gracefully are, in your mind, marked and mapped with total seriousness. The passengers see a lovely little routine. You see the plan you would actually execute if disaster arrived. You carry both truths, the reassurance and the readiness, simultaneously, without a flicker of strain crossing your face. Chapter 12, The Galley. Welcome to the galley, a kitchen the size of a closet that would send a modern chef into early retirement. In these years, there are no tidy rolling carts to spare your back, so you carry heavy trays by hand, up and down a narrow aisle, over and over, for the length of the flight. The space is tight, hot, and packed floor to ceiling with everything needed to feed a full cabin. You're part cook, part waitress, part acrobat, all at once, balancing scalding coffee and hot plates while the floor beneath you refuses to sit still. The heat has nowhere to escape, so you work in your button jacket and firm girdle, sweating quietly while plating meals in what amounts to a small oven. This is the least photogenic square footage on the entire aircraft, and you spend a substantial portion of your shift crammed inside it. The truly punishing part is what's missing entirely, the wheeled carts that will one day carry this weight for you. Here, you haul every loaded tray, every heavy pot by hand, flight after flight, and your arms and back absorb the whole burden with no mechanical assistance whatsoever. Now put that labor on a moving floor, because the aircraft never sits truly still. You brace, you time your steps to the rhythm of the ride, you keep the tray level while the world tilts beneath your feet. You become, out of pure necessity, a balance artist. By the end of a shift, the galley has taken its toll on your arms, your back, your feet, and your general sense of having survived something. The passengers never see this corner and have no idea what it costs. They only see the finished plate arriving gracefully at their seat, which is, of course, exactly how you're meant to make it look. Chapter 13, Dinner at Altitude. Now the meal service begins, and this is nothing like a small bag of snacks. Air travel in this era is a luxury occasion, so you may be plating full dinners, sometimes even carving a roast right there in the cabin, like a butler working at 4,000 feet. You balance real china, real cutlery, real gravy, over the laps of well-dressed strangers, while the plane bounces gently to remind everyone who's actually in charge. One patch of rough air at exactly the wrong moment, and someone's fine suit becomes tonight's entree. Passengers dress up for these flights and expect to be fed like they're seated in a proper restaurant, rather than strapped into a rattling metal tube, and your job is to make that fantasy feel real. In the grandest moments, this means slicing a roast in the aisle with a butler's poise, while the aircraft sways around you, genuine showmanship performed on an unsteady stage. All this elegance rests on things that are breakable, spillable, and heavy. Real china shatters, real gravy slides. You carry these hazards over strangers' laps while the floor beneath you refuses to hold still, timing every movement to the rhythm of the ride, setting the plate down during a calm stretch, bracing through the bumps. You've seen the disaster happen to someone else, and you spend the whole service quietly determined it won't happen to you tonight. Through all of it, you smile, because the elegance is the product and the labor is meant to disappear entirely. The passenger sees a graceful woman gliding through the cabin. He never sees the intense concentration required to keep his dinner off his trousers. Chapter 14, Cocktails at 4,000 feet. Then comes the drink service, and in this era that means something considerably stronger than tea. You mix, pour, and refill throughout the flight, keeping the cabin cheerful, which sounds pleasant until you remember that alcohol at altitude has a way of bringing out people's worst instincts. A few drinks in, the quiet businessman from boarding becomes a comedian, a philosopher, or a flirt, and you are the captive audience for whichever version shows up. The trouble with altitude is that it changes people, and confinement changes them further. The reserved man from an hour ago is now telling jokes and needs you to laugh at every one of them, or he's turned philosophical, and needs you to hear his complete views on marriage and the state of the nation. Worse is the version the alcohol makes bold. The one who decides your forced smile is an invitation, who starts leaning in, growing familiar in ways no sober stranger would attempt. You can't simply walk away, because you're sealed in a metal tube with him for hours, and the entire ethos of the job insists the customer is indulged. So you become an expert at the gentle ration. You cannot cut a paying passenger off with a scowl, but you can slow the pace, water the next one down, take your time on the refill. It's a delicate diplomacy, keeping the cabin merry without letting it slide into chaos. You are, in effect, quietly managing a problem you're also the one pouring. And you do it all with that unshakable smile, because visible irritation is never permitted no matter how many times you've heard the same joke. Chapter 15. Breathing the Blue Haze. Now breathe in deep, or actually maybe don't. Almost everyone smokes in this era, constantly and without a second thought, right there in the sealed cabin you're trapped inside for hours. The air slowly turns hazy and blue. Your uniform absorbs the smell. Your lungs quietly file their own formal complaint. There's no fresh air section, no polite way to ask an entire generation to please stop. Cigarettes are simply part of travel here, as ordinary as the luggage. So the air inside your workplace transforms hour by hour into something you can practically see, a bluish fog building with every fresh cigarette, thickening because this closed cabin has nowhere for the smoke to go except into everything, including you. By mid-flight you're working inside a gently glowing haze, tray in hand, smiling as though the atmosphere were perfectly clear. Your uniform drinks in every wisp of it, until the crisp outfit you assembled so carefully this morning is, by landing, thoroughly perfumed with stale smoke. You step off the aircraft smelling like the inside of a crowded tavern, no matter how fresh you started the day. There's nothing to be done about it. Asking paying passengers to extinguish their cigarettes would, in this era, be considered baffling, even rude. So you work through the fog, hand out ashtrays, empty them, and accept the smell as simply the cost of doing business. Chapter 16. Riding through the weather. Because these low, slow aircraft fly through weather rather than above it, turbulence is a constant companion, and turbulence has one very predictable effect on the human stomach. Air sickness is common enough that the humble paper bag becomes one of your most frequently used pieces of equipment. You distribute them, collect them, comfort the green-faced, and somehow keep serving everyone else while the cabin rolls like a small boat caught in choppy water. Comforting the afflicted is its own quiet art. A miserable, queasy passenger needs reassurance as much as they need the bag itself. A steady presence, a kind word, the calm sense that someone competent is handling things. So you soothe them, murmuring that it will pass, that landing isn't far, tending to them gently and without judgment, even as the same motion sickening them is working on your own balance too. Remarkably, you manage all of this while continuing to serve everyone else on the plane. There are still meals to clear and drinks to refill and requests to answer, and you switch between tending the sick and serving the well in an instant, all on a floor that keeps pitching beneath you. No advertisement ever depicted this part, the unglamorous, unspoken labor of caring for people at their most wretched, performed with a grace that turns something genuinely grim into something nearly invisible. Chapter 17. What the Body Pays. By now your own body is staging a quiet rebellion. You've been standing for hours in heels the company insists upon, walking a narrow aisle more times than anyone could count, lifting heavy trays, bending, twisting, balancing, without letting a single crack of strain show through your expression. Your arches ache. Your back complains. Your hands tremble faintly with fatigue by the later hours. Start with the standing alone, punishment enough on its own, done in shoes built to look lovely across a room rather than labor through a 14-hour shift. Then the walking, endless and repetitive, adding up to a genuine trek logged in a space barely wider than your shoulders. Then the lifting, where the real labor announces itself. Those trays are heavy. And there are no carts to spare your spine. You haul the weight by hand, over and over, bending to reach low seats, twisting to serve across a row, all while the aircraft sways beneath you. It's the labor of a professional mover, dressed up in white gloves and a pillbox hat. And through every ache of it, the cardinal rule holds firm: the strain must never show. This, arguably, is the hardest labor in the entire job, the emotional discipline of hiding genuine physical suffering behind a mask of effortless charm. The public sees a beautiful woman gliding through the cabin and imagines a life of ease. They never see the aching arches or the trembling hands. The charm is real. So is the labor beneath it, and the labor is the part that stays hidden. Chapter 18. The Man in Seat 6. And here he is, the passenger who mistakes friendliness for an open invitation. In an era that markets you as part of the cabin's scenery, some men feel entitled to comment on your appearance, reach for your arm as you pass, or ask questions no stranger should ever ask a working woman. You're expected to deflect it all with a laugh, because complaining isn't considered ladylike, and the customer is always right, even when he's very much wrong. The root of the problem sits in how the whole role is marketed. You've been sold as part of the glamour, part of the experience, practically part of the decor, and some passengers absorb that message a little too literally. They see not a working professional but an amenity, a pleasant accessory to their journey who exists for their enjoyment. A man who sees you that way tends to behave accordingly. It begins with comments about your looks, delivered as though you'd requested a review. For some, it escalates, a hand catching your arm as you pass, a question no polite stranger would dream of asking. You're being treated as though your presence in the cabin were an open invitation, as though the uniform came bundled with permission. It did not, though good luck explaining that to him. So you develop a whole quiet arsenal, the graceful sidestep that keeps you just out of reach, the firm but charming redirect that changes the subject without wounding his pride, the bright deflecting laugh that treats an overstep as a harmless joke, the smile that stays fixed while your teeth grit quietly behind it. Nobody trained you for this in charm school, not officially, and nobody ever thanks you for the skill. Yet it runs beneath the whole job like a current, the steady, unrecognized work of protecting your own dignity without ever being permitted to defend it openly. Chapter 19. Surprise, you're also the medical staff. Tucked into your list of duties is a role that turns you, without warning, into the closest thing to a doctor for miles in any direction. Stewardesses are trained in first aid and expected to handle whatever the human body decides to do mid-flight: fainting, panic, the occasional genuine emergency. Someone feels faint. Someone's ears are in agony from the pressure. Someone's had one cocktail too many and needs quiet monitoring. You keep a calm voice and steady hands while running silently through everything you learned in training, because there is no hospital at 4,000 feet. For the length of this flight, the closest thing to a doctor anyone aboard is going to get is you and your small kit. The range runs from mild to genuinely frightening, a passenger going pale and lightheaded, another in real pain from pressure changes tormenting their ears, a third who's had too much to drink and now needs careful watching so a bad decision doesn't become a real crisis. And then, rarer but real, the moments when a passenger's condition becomes a true emergency, with no help within reach but you. These are the moments your training was actually for. Calm becomes your most important instrument here, more vital even than anything in your medical kit. A frightened cabin takes its emotional cue from you, so your voice stays level and your hands stay sure, even as your mind is racing through the correct response. Panic spreads. Calm contains it. You are, in that moment, the source of the calm the whole cabin needs. Chapter 20. Therapist, Babysitter, Bouncer. Flying is still new and genuinely frightening to a great many people in this era, so a real portion of your job is emotional support with wings attached. You hold the hand of the white-knuckled first-timer gripping the armrest as though sheer force might keep the plane in the air. You reassure the woman convinced that every bump of turbulence signals the end. You entertain the small child who's decided the aisle makes an excellent racetrack, and your leg is the finish line. You're a therapist to the anxious, coaxing frightened adults through their fear with soft words and a practiced, steady presence. You're a babysitter to the restless children, keeping them amused enough to stay out of harm's way. You're occasionally something closer to a bouncer, managing the ones who won't settle down and keeping order in a confined space. And the truly demanding part is that none of this emotional labor replaces the physical labor. It simply stacks directly on top of it. You're soothing a nervous flyer with one hand while balancing the coffee pot with the other, comforting a crying child while remembering exactly who still needs their meal cleared. There is no pausing service to tend to feelings. You manage the hearts and the hands simultaneously, and you make it look effortless. Chapter 21, The Paycheck. Now let's look at the money and try not to laugh or wince too hard. After all that beauty, all that training, all those standards and all that physical punishment, the pay turns out to be surprisingly thin. You're selling glamour to the public, but you are not, in any real sense, living it yourself. The airline gets a walking advertisement and a hardworking employee bundled into one modestly compensated package, and prestige is supposed to make up the difference. Prestige, as it happens, does not pay rent or soothe aching feet. Consider everything the job has demanded up to this point: surviving a brutal application process, weeks of transformative training, submission to the scale and the girdle and the endless grooming standards, hauling heavy trays through turbulence, tending the sick, soothing the frightened, fending off the handsy. That's an extraordinary volume of skilled, demanding labor, and you'd reasonably expect it to be compensated accordingly. Then you see the actual number, and it simply doesn't match the effort. There's a real irony buried in this arrangement. You spend your working life selling a fantasy of luxury and abundance to well-heeled passengers, while your own paycheck keeps you firmly planted in the ordinary. You pour the cocktails and carve the roasts of a world you personally can't quite afford to inhabit. From the airline's perspective, of course. This is a marvel of efficiency. Hearing you gets them a smiling advertisement and a tireless worker bundled into a single modest wage, marketing and labor combined into one person, paid as though she's merely one small thing rather than the many demanding things she actually is. The justification offered, spoken or not, is prestige. The job is glamorous, isn't it? Admired, envied, held up as a dream career for young women everywhere. Surely that admiration counts for something. There's a quiet manipulation folded into that logic, the notion that you should be grateful enough for the shine of the job that you won't mind being underpaid for the substance of it. But prestige is not currency. It doesn't restock the cupboard. It doesn't ease the aching feet dragged home after 14 hours in mandated heels. So you do the only thing the job permits. You smile, and you say nothing, because complaining about pay, like complaining about anything else, was never part of the image. Chapter 22, A Life Under Supervision. You might picture an independent, jet-setting woman who answers to nobody. The reality, especially in the early years of your career, resembles something closer to a strict boarding school. Your living arrangements, your off-duty behavior, and even your appearance when you're not working can all fall under company scrutiny, complete with curfews, assigned roommates, and supervisors keeping a watchful eye. You represent the airline every waking hour, and there are standards to uphold even when nobody's paying you to uphold them. Your housing itself may be a matter of company concern, shared quarters with other stewardesses, arrangements the airline has a say in, overseen the way a dormitory might be overseen rather than the private residence of a grown, employed professional. There can be curfews restricting your comings and goings, as though you're a schoolgirl rather than a woman doing genuinely demanding work. Your conduct off the clock is watched, because a stewardess behaving poorly in her private time still reflects on the company, and your appearance remains under review even during your time off, since as far as the airline is concerned, the image doesn't get to rest just because you've taken off the uniform. The effect is that your life never entirely feels like your own. You're perpetually, quietly on duty, aware of being observed, aware of being measured against the ideal you were hired to embody, even during your own leisure hours. It's an exhausting way to exist, this sense that you can never fully step outside the role, that the poised, proper stewardess has to live on even after the shift technically ends. Chapter 23. A lonely kind of adventure. There is a genuine upside buried in all of this, and it deserves its due. The job really does carry you across the country in a way few young women of this era get to experience. Layovers drop you into city after city, each one yours to sample for a handful of hours before moving on. You collect towns the way other people collect postcards. But those hours are limited, and how you spend them depends entirely on what the shift has left in your tank. Sometimes you use the time to explore, to walk an unfamiliar street before it's time to move on again. More often, after a long day on your feet, you spend the hours simply resting, lying down in yet another unfamiliar room, letting your body recover before the next flight demands everything from you all over again. The hotel rooms themselves start to blur together. The same bedspread, the same curtains, the same little desk, the same telephone that will ring you awake at some ungodly hour. You live out of a small bag, perpetually half-packed, never quite settled anywhere. Home becomes something you visit between trips rather than a place you actually live. There's a particular loneliness threaded through all of it. You eat dinner alone in strange cities, far from family, far from anyone who actually knows your name. The freedom of travel arrives bundled together with the isolation of being perpetually a stranger passing through. It's a romantic kind of solitude in its way, but it's loneliness all the same, and no amount of new scenery quite fills the space it leaves behind. Then morning arrives with the same ringing telephone, and the whole cycle begins again, city to city, room to room, call to call, with barely a pause to catch your breath. Chapter 24. Love carefully managed. Given that the entire job markets you as the ideal single woman, it's no surprise that romance comes wrapped in its own rulebook. Dating certain coworkers may be quietly discouraged, and the ever-present marriage ban means any serious relationship instantly becomes a secret worth protecting. Passengers propose. Pilots flirt. The world seems to assume you're perpetually available for courtship, and you navigate all of it carefully, because one misstep, one whispered engagement overheard, could end the career you worked so hard to build. Everything about the job's marketing conspires to make you an object of romantic interest, whether you want the role or not. You're sold to the public as the ideal eligible young woman, charming, available, endlessly courtable, and of course romance swirls around you as reliably as turbulence. The trouble is you're expected to appear perpetually available while never actually being caught, threading a needle between projected availability and its forbidden conclusion. The complications start close to home, with your own colleagues. Relationships with certain coworkers may be discouraged outright, which is awkward given these are the people you spend your entire working life beside. And overshadowing everything is the marriage ban itself, the threat that turns any real relationship into contraband, forcing any genuine romance underground, conducted in whispers, protected the way one might guard something fragile and forbidden. The deeper the feeling grows, the greater the risk, a cruel bargain to strike with your own heart. Meanwhile, the outside world presses in with its own assumptions. Passengers propose in earnest, dazzled by the fantasy the airline has sold them. Pilots flirt with practiced ease. Everyone seems to assume romance is simply part of what you're for. You field it all with practiced grace, never quite encouraging it, never quite shutting it down either, forever managing other people's expectations of your own heart, all while knowing a single misstep could cost you the career itself. Chapter 25. The machine behind the fantasy. At the center of all this sits an entire industry dedicated to making your job look magical. The airlines lean hard into the image of the poised, endlessly cheerful stewardess, plastering her across posters and advertisements as the very symbol of modern travel. You are the glossy face of the whole enterprise. What the public never sees is the girdle, the scale, the smoke, the aching arches, and the man in seat 6. You keep the fantasy intact precisely by hiding the labor, which turns out to be the hardest labor of all. The airlines have built an entire apparatus around making your work appear effortless and enchanting, and it's remarkably effective. That radiant figure on the poster isn't an accident, she's a carefully constructed product, and you're the one wearing her every single day. When people picture flying, they picture you, poised and lovely, gliding through a sunlit cabin with a graceful smile, carrying the entire romantic weight of the jet age on your shoulders. But you know exactly what stands behind that glossy image, because you've lived every hidden hour of it. The public never sees the girdle cinched tight beneath the uniform, quietly working on your midsection through a long shift. They never see the ritual weigh-ins, the constant management of your own body. They don't smell the smoke soaked permanently into your uniform, don't feel the ache in your mandated heels, don't witness the man in seat 6 and all his entitled kin. Every unglamorous truth of the job stays carefully out of frame. Keeping it out of frame is precisely the deepest labor of the entire profession, the relentless emotional discipline of making struggle look effortless, hour after hour, day after day. You're not merely doing a demanding job. You're simultaneously concealing just how demanding it actually is, and that concealment takes a toll no one sees and no one credits. Chapter 26, Flying Through the Storm. The real conditions of the work, the long hours, the rough weather never stop being there beneath the glamour, waiting to test you all over again. These early flights are long, and the technology to route cleanly around bad weather is limited, so your day can stretch and twist with every storm the sky decides to produce. Flights get bumpy, get delayed, get rerouted, and you ride out all of it while keeping the cabin calm and fed. There's no smooth cruise above the clouds waiting to rescue you. The length of these flights is the first hard fact of the work. Low, slow aircraft turn every journey into a genuine endurance test. Hours upon hours spent on your feet serving, soothing, and smiling with no shortcut to the end. Compounding this is the limited ability to dodge bad weather entirely, so the weather simply comes as it comes, bending and stretching your day around it. Flights turn bumpy, flights get delayed, flights get rerouted around some churning system, adding hours nobody planned for. Through every disruption, your job stays exactly the same: keep the cabin calm, keep the passengers fed, no matter how badly the weather outside is behaving. And crucially, there's no reprieve waiting for you above the clouds. These planes fly through the weather, not above it, which means the shuddering can feel nearly constant on a rough day. You top off the coffee while the floor bucks beneath you like something alive, and you do it without spilling and without any visible sign of strain. It's an extraordinary feat of nerve and balance, and you make it look like nothing at all. Chapter 27, What Altitude Does to the Body. And the storms don't just shake the cabin and stretch the schedule. They work quietly on your body too, in ways as relentless as they are invisible. The human body was never designed for repeated changes in cabin pressure, and yours experiences them over and over. Ears pop and ache. Sinuses throb. The constant shifts in altitude leave you a little worn down even on an otherwise easy day. Passengers suffer through this too, often more acutely, clutching their heads on descent, wincing as the pressure builds behind their faces. And naturally, you're the one who tends to them, moving through the cabin, handing out gum to help them equalize, offering reassurance, easing their discomfort even as your own head throbs right along with theirs. You've learned to work through pressure headaches the same way you've learned to work through everything else this job demands, quietly, gracefully, without ever letting it show on your face. Your own aching head, as ever, stays your own private secret. Chapter 28, A Harder Truth. It's worth pausing here for something more serious, something that has nothing to do with turbulence or pressure, and everything to do with who was permitted through the door in the first place. The glamorous stewardess of the 1950s was, by deliberate company policy, almost always young, white, and shaped to fit a narrow mold, and women of color were effectively excluded from these positions for most of the decade. This is a real and important part of the history, and it deserves to be stated plainly, without any humor attached to it. This exclusion was no accident. It was policy, enforced, deliberate, and built directly into the hearing standards we've been describing all along. The same qualities that would have made countless women exceptional at this work. The poise, the warmth, the calm under pressure, counted for nothing against a system determined to keep the role narrow. It was a door closed unjustly, and it stayed closed to far too many people for far too long. That door only began to open later in the decade, and it did not open on its own. It was pushed open by the courage and persistence of women who refused to accept that the sky belonged only to some. Their determination to challenge a system built specifically to exclude them is the reason the door began to give it all. Telling this part matters, because a history of this era that left it out would be an incomplete and dishonest one. The glamour was real, so was the exclusion. Both belong in any honest telling of what this job and this decade actually were. The struggle of the women who broke through this barrier deserves to be remembered as a matter of genuine dignity and courage, not wrapped in the same light tone we've used elsewhere for girdles and cocktails and difficult passengers. Some things simply deserve to be stated clearly and left standing on their own. Chapter 29, The End of the Runway. And so we arrive at the last chapter of the journey. One day, whether by marriage, by age, or by the airline simply deciding your time was up, the uniform comes off for good. For many women, this entire career lasted only a handful of years, a short, bright chapter before they were quietly guided back toward ordinary life. Some felt relief, others were heartbroken. All of them carried away the aching feet, the hard-won poise, and a strange private pride in having been, for a little while, the calm, smiling center of a roaring machine in the sky. The ending arrives for nearly everyone eventually, brought on by one of the forces that shadowed the entire career from the start. Perhaps it's marriage, that long-forbidden happiness finally chosen over the job. Perhaps it's age, the ticking clock finally running out as the calendar crosses the company's arbitrary line. Or perhaps the airline simply decides, for reasons of its own, that the time has come. However it happens, the roaring machine flies on without you. For most women, the whole chapter proves remarkably brief, a handful of demanding, bright seasons rather than a lifelong career. And then, quite suddenly, it simply isn't your life anymore. Some walked away relieved, glad to set down the girdle and the aching feet and the endless smiling in exchange for something gentler. Others walked away grieving a role they'd loved and fought hard for, pushed out by rules that had nothing to do with how well they'd actually done the work. But whatever they felt in that final moment, they all carried the same things forward: the aching feet, the physical memory of all those hours in mandated heels, the hard-won poise, that unshakable grace under pressure forged permanently into who they'd become, and beneath it all, a genuine and quiet pride. Not merely the pretty face from a recruitment poster, but the calm, smiling heart of a roaring machine in the sky. The woman who fed and soothed and safeguarded a cabin full of strangers through smoke and turbulence, and the man in seat 6, making it all look like nothing at all. So there you have it, a single stretch of life as a 1950s stewardess. From the ringing hotel telephone before dawn to the day the uniform came off for the final time. You survived the scale and the girdle, the button jacket in a sweltering cabin, heels that despised your feet. You carved a roast at 4,000 feet, poured drinks for a man who wouldn't stop talking, handed out paper bags through turbulence, and calmed a trembling first-time flyer, all while breathing air the color of a nightclub. You were, in the span of a single shift, a cook, a waitress, a nurse, a therapist, a babysitter, and a bouncer, and you did every bit of it with a smile that was never once allowed to slip. Strip away the glossy posters, and what's left is extraordinarily hard work. And the hardest work of all was hiding just how hard it actually was, keeping the fantasy pristine while your body quietly wore down beneath the pretty uniform. So tonight, as you settle into your own bed, with no front desk call coming, No scale waiting for you in the morning, no supervisor checking your left hand for a ring. Maybe spare a warm thought for those women. The ones who smiled through the smoke and the aching arches and the man in seat 6, and the ones who fought their way through a door unfairly closed to them, so the sky could eventually belong to more people than it once did. They were tougher than the glamour ever let on, poised, patient, stubborn, and quietly heroic, holding a coffee pot steady while the whole world shook around them. Rest easy now. Your feet don't hurt, you're already home. Chapter 30. The names behind the glamour. Before we go further, it's worth pausing to understand which companies built this whole system, because the airlines of this era weren't interchangeable. Pan American World Airways sold prestige and international sophistication. United Airlines leaned into wholesome American charm. TWA wrapped itself in a certain worldly glamour, thanks in part to Howard Hughes's ownership and his very particular, very public opinions about what a stewardess should look like. Each airline ran its own training school, printed its own manual of standards, and enforced its own version of the same basic bargain: your youth and your obedience, traded for a uniform and a paycheck that never quite matched the labor. The training schools themselves became legendary in their own right. United School outside Chicago processed thousands of hopeful young women a year, each cohort smaller than the number of applicants by a staggering margin. Some schools ran for 4 weeks, others stretched to 7, but the core curriculum stayed remarkably consistent across every airline: grooming, poise, service, and only then, almost as an afterthought in terms of hours allocated, the emergency procedures that actually kept people alive. A woman who'd spent years in nursing school could wash out of stewardess training over an unruly eyebrow or an ungainly walk. The standards weren't really about competence. They were about manufacturing a specific, marketable type of woman, replicated identically across an entire fleet of aircraft. Chapter 31. The weigh-in in detail. Let's sit inside that weigh-in room a little longer, because the ritual deserves more than a passing glance. Picture a small office near the crew lounge, a metal scale bolted to the floor, and a supervisor with a clipboard who has done this exact routine hundreds of times before you and will do it hundreds of times after. You step up in your stocking feet because shoes add weight nobody wants counted against them. The needle swings, settles, and the number gets written down in a ledger that will follow you for the rest of your employment. If the number sits comfortably below the line, you get a nod and you're free to go. If it creeps close to the ceiling, the supervisor's expression shifts just slightly into something between concern and warning. And if you've crossed the line entirely, the conversation that follows is calm, procedural, and utterly humiliating in its politeness. You'll be given a window, often 30 days, to bring the number back down, sometimes with a company nutritionist's suggestions attached, suggestions that read more like punishment than guidance. Miss that window and you can be pulled from active flying, your income cut, your status suspended, until the scale forgives you. Women talked about this ritual amongst themselves in hushed, weary tones, trading strategies for the days before a scheduled weigh-in, skipping meals, drinking nothing but black coffee, wearing the lightest possible undergarments. It became its own private, unspoken curriculum, running parallel to the official one, taught roommate to roommate rather than instructor to student. Nobody wrote it in the manual. Everybody knew it by heart. Chapter 32. A closer look at the girdle inspection. We touched on the girdle inspection earlier, but it deserves a fuller accounting because the sheer administrative seriousness with which it was treated tells you everything about how this industry viewed the women wearing its uniform. A supervisor doing a pre-flight check might run a hand along a waistline or simply ask a stewardess to turn, assessing the smoothness of the silhouette the way a tailor might assess a suit on a mannequin. There was no ambiguity in what was being checked, and there was no real avenue for objection. Some women found small, quiet ways to push back within the boundaries of the rule, choosing the lightest, least restrictive girdle that would still pass inspection, loosening a hook the moment they were out of a supervisor's sightline, only to retighten it before the next check. These were tiny, private rebellions, invisible to the passengers, invisible to the company, known only to the woman herself and maybe the roommate who helped her back into the thing before a shift. It was resistance measured in millimeters, but it was resistance all the same. Chapter 33, the manual itself. Every airline produced its own employee manual, and reading one today feels like reading a document from an entirely different species of workplace. Alongside genuine emergency procedures, how to operate a life raft, how to fight a small onboard fire, how to calm a cabin during decompression, sat entire sections dedicated to acceptable hairstyles, illustrated with sketches of the correct silhouette from 3 different angles. Sections on posture included diagrams of a woman's spine, annotated with the precise curve considered flattering. Sections on conversation coached stewardesses on how to field difficult questions from passengers without ever appearing flustered, offering suggested scripted responses for common scenarios, including, unbelievably, scripted responses for fielding a marriage proposal from a passenger without either encouraging or offending him. The manual didn't merely describe a job. It described a personality, assembled piece by piece, and expected every woman wearing the uniform to perform that personality identically, regardless of who she actually was underneath it. Chapter 34, A Day the Weather One. Let's walk through one specific kind of day in detail, the kind every stewardess eventually experiences and never quite forgets. You take off under a sky that looks manageable, a little gray, nothing alarming. 2 hours in, the captain's voice comes back through the intercom, calm but clipped, warning of weather ahead that the flight plan hadn't anticipated. You feel the aircraft begin to shudder before he even finishes the sentence. What follows is 40 minutes of the kind of turbulence that turns a routine meal service into something closer to a controlled emergency. Trays you were carrying get set down mid-aisle because carrying them further has become genuinely dangerous. You brace yourself against seatbacks, moving passenger to passenger not to serve now but to reassure, gripping an armrest here, offering a steady hand there. Somewhere behind you, a paper bag gets used, then another. A child cries. An older man grips his armrest so hard his knuckles have gone pale, and you crouch beside him, your voice pitched low and even telling him this happens, that the pilots know exactly what they're doing, that you've flown through worse. You believe some of what you're saying and you don't entirely believe all of it, but none of that uncertainty is allowed anywhere near your face. 40 minutes stretches into what feels like several hours. Then, as suddenly as it started, the shaking eases, the sky opens back into something calmer, and you finish the meal service you'd abandoned, apologizing pleasantly for the delay as though nothing more dramatic than a slow kitchen had caused it. Passengers thank you for your calm. None of them will ever know what it cost you to produce. Chapter 35, The Unspoken Sisterhood. For all the competition to land one of these positions, and for all the individual isolation of hotel rooms and unfamiliar cities, there existed a real, quiet sisterhood among the women doing this work. Roommates on layovers became confidants by necessity, swapping girdle loosening tricks and weigh-in strategies, warning each other about which supervisors ran strict inspections and which let small infractions slide. A senior stewardess might slip a nervous newcomer a private word of advice about handling a particular kind of difficult passenger. Knowledge passed hand to hand because the official manual never covered it. This informal network became, in its own understated way, a form of protection the company never intended to provide. Women looked out for each other in ways the airlines didn't require and didn't particularly reward. It was solidarity built entirely off the clock, in shared hotel rooms and crew lounges, a quiet counterweight to a system designed to keep each woman feeling individually replaceable. Chapter 36, The Fight for the Door. We mentioned earlier that women of color were, for most of this decade, systematically excluded from stewardess positions. It's worth spending real time on how that exclusion actually operated, because it wasn't incidental. It was baked into every layer of the hearing process we've already described. The height and weight charts, the complexion standards, the vague personality assessments that supposedly measured warmth and poise, all of it functioned, whether stated outright in a company memo or simply understood by every interviewer conducting the process, to keep the role reserved for a narrow demographic. Women who challenged this exclusion did so at real personal cost, applying repeatedly to companies that had no intention of hearing them, filing complaints, pushing through doors that had been deliberately built to keep them out. Their persistence, spread across individual acts of courage rather than one single dramatic breakthrough, gradually forced airlines to begin hearing more broadly as the decade wore toward its close. This wasn't a moment of sudden enlightened policy change from the companies themselves. It was the result of sustained pressure from women who simply refused to accept the closed door as permanent. This part of the history carries a weight the rest of this story doesn't, and it shouldn't be smoothed over or rushed past. The same industry capable of building an elaborate, glittering fantasy around a very specific kind of woman was, simultaneously, actively and deliberately excluding countless other capable women from ever wearing that uniform at all. Both truths belong in the full picture. Chapter 37: Coffee, Tea, or Public Perception. By the later years of the decade, and into the one that followed, the stewardess had become something bigger than an occupation. She'd become a cultural symbol, discussed in magazines, featured in advertising campaigns that had little to do with actual air travel, treated by the broader public as a kind of aspirational figure wrapped in mystery and glamour. This cultural weight added its own invisible burden. You weren't just doing a demanding job. You were also, whether you wanted the role or not, embodying an entire fantasy the culture had built around women like you, one that had almost nothing to do with the actual texture of your working life. Popular culture leaned hard into a particular reductive image: the stewardess as available, flirtatious, endlessly cheerful, existing primarily for the entertainment of the men she served. This image circulated far beyond the cabin itself, shaping how passengers treated you before you'd even said a word to them, shaping the assumptions the man in seat 6 carried onto the plane with him. You were fighting, every single shift, against a caricature that had been constructed without your input and that you had no real power to correct. Chapter 38: The Physical Legacy. Consider what a decade or more of this labor did to a woman's body over time, for those relatively few who managed to stay in the profession past the usual short tenure. Chronic foot problems from years in mandated heels, lower back strain from a career of lifting heavy trays without mechanical assistance, hearing changes from years spent working inside the constant roar of propeller engines, skin and respiratory effects from thousands of hours breathing cabin air thick with cigarette smoke. None of this made it onto the recruitment poster. None of it factored into the glossy magazine spreads. It simply accumulated quietly, the private cost of a public fantasy, carried forward long after the uniform came off for the final time. The real numbers behind the fantasy. Let's put actual figures behind everything we've described so far, because the real documented standards are, if anything, stranger than anything a script could invent. One 1954 hearing document from Chicago and Southern Airlines, since absorbed into Delta, listed 19 separate qualifications for the job. Height had to fall between 5'2" and 5'5". Weight had to land somewhere between 100 and 120 pounds. Eyesight had to be perfect, glasses forbidden outright. Hair had to be its natural color. And buried among the physical specifications sat a flatly stated requirement that an applicant be single and not engaged, not simply unmarried, but not even promised to anyone yet. By the late 1960s at United Airlines, the maximum allowable weight for its stewardesses was written into policy as 135 pounds regardless of a woman's frame, and a stewardess who drifted over that line, even briefly, could be sent home without pay until she brought the number back down. The company that hired you, weighed you, and could suspend your income over a few pounds was the same company plastering your image across a national advertising campaign as the picture of glamour. The age ceiling wasn't industry folklore either. It was openly stated policy at multiple carriers. TWA grounded its stewardesses at 35. Northwest Orient and American Airlines set the line at 32. And when the practice was eventually challenged before Congress as a matter of employment discrimination, one airline executive defending the policy was quoted plainly attributing it to what he called simply the sex thing. An admission, in his own words, that the rule had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with how a woman was expected to look. The marriage ban operated with the same bluntness. As late as 1965, a United Airlines district sales manager, defending the policy publicly, argued that the job simply wasn't compatible with married life, since a wife would need to be away for days at a stretch while working long hours. Apparently a hardship reserved exclusively for female cabin crew, since male pilots managed an identical schedule while married without anyone questioning their commitment to their households. And the racial exclusion this industry practiced wasn't abstract or merely cultural. It was enforced through explicit rejection letters and formal hearing policy. In early 1957, a young registered nurse named Ruth Carroll Taylor applied to TWA and was turned away under a rejection citing physical standards, language her contemporaries understood as a common euphemism for exclusion by race. Rather than accept it, Taylor filed a formal complaint with the New York State Commission against discrimination. Around the same time, a smaller regional carrier called Mohawk Airlines signaled interest in hiring its first black stewardess, and Taylor applied alongside roughly 800 other black women competing for the single opening. She was the one selected, hired in December of 1957, and on February 11, 1958, she flew as a working stewardess from Ithaca to New York City, the first black flight attendant in American aviation history. Her tenure lasted only 6 months. She married later that year, and under Mohawk's policy, identical to the marriage bans enforced across the industry, she was required to resign. 3 months after her historic first flight, competitive pressure led TWA to hire its own first black stewardess, Margaret Grant, becoming the first major national carrier to do so. Progress remained slow and grudging even after that. American carriers hired no further black flight attendants until 1960, when Capital Airlines hired Patricia Banks, and only after the New York State Commission Against Discrimination legally ordered the company to do it. Following a discrimination suit Banks had filed with the backing of Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Taylor herself, reflecting on the moment decades later, was characteristically unsentimental about her own place in the story. She said plainly that it hadn't mattered to her personally that she be the one to break the barrier, only that a black woman finally would be. It took 50 years until 2008 for the New York State Assembly to formally recognize what she'd done. Chapter 39, The Women Who Organized. Everything we've described so far as simply the rules was, at some point, a set of conditions a group of working women decided to fight. The very first stewardess in American history was a registered nurse named Ellen Church, who took to the air for Boeing Air Transport on May 15, 1930. Church hadn't set out to become a stewardess at all. She'd wanted to be a pilot, and when the airlines refused to consider a woman for that role, she pitched them on the next best thing, hiring trained nurses to reassure a nervous flying public that the new and frightening business of air travel was safe. It worked, and an entire profession was born from that compromise. By the 1940s, a United Airlines stewardess named Ada Brown had risen to chief stewardess and spent years quietly pushing her employer for better pay, safer scheduling, and protection from arbitrary firing, and getting, In her own words, nothing but company parties in return. So in 1944, Brown recruited 4 colleagues, Edith Lauterbach, Frances Hall, Sally Tomitz, and Sally Watt, and together the 5 of them founded the Airline Stewardesses Association, officially established on August 22, 1945. Within months, roughly 3/4 of United Stewardesses had signed union cards, and by 1946, the union had won its first contract, raising monthly pay to $155 and securing limited duty hours, guaranteed rest periods, and an actual grievance process for the first time. The irony of the union's own founding leadership is hard to overstate. In 1947, Ada Brown, the woman who built this entire movement, got married, and under the very marriage ban her union was trying to dismantle, she was forced to resign from both her job and the presidency of the union she'd created. The rules she'd spent years fighting took her down before she could finish the fight. Progress from there came slowly and unevenly. The age restriction wasn't overturned until 1968, using Title VII of the Civil Rights Act as legal leverage. And by that point, the average stewardess career lasted only about 18 months, largely because of the very policies being challenged. The marriage ban itself wasn't struck down by the courts until 1971, the same year the profession finally opened to men. The rigid weight requirements lingered even longer, not loosened until 1979, after continued union pressure. One Michigan Congresswoman, Martha Griffiths, became a fierce ally in this fight in Congress, and when a defensive airline executive testified that a stewardess needed to be young, single, and attractive, her retort is preserved word for word in the congressional record. She asked him whether he was running an airline or a brothel. Chapter 40, 8 miles on a single flight. One more detail deserves its own space, because it says more about the physical reality of this job than almost anything else we've covered. In 1948, a stewardess wore a pedometer during a single flight from Chicago to Miami, just to see what the job actually demanded of her body. By the time the aircraft landed, the pedometer showed she had walked 8 miles, inside a metal tube barely wider than her shoulders, back and forth along the same narrow aisle, over and over, for the length of one shift. 8 miles. Not across open country, not with room to stretch her stride, but confined to a corridor she could nearly touch both walls of at once. That's the real measured distance behind everything we've described: the trays, the coffee pot, the paper bags, the reassurances murmured to a frightened first-time flyer. It's a fact that needs no embellishment at all. It simply needs to be said plainly and left to sit.